What's going on, guys? Briar Rabbit here. Today we are taking a look at FRAMERIPPER. So if you're not familiar with this PC, you can actually watch the full build over on the YouTube channel. I'll put a link down in the description. It's 3.5 hours long, but I literally go through, from having the parts on the table to building what you see here with a few minor additions kind of afterwards. So I'm going to go over today what the performance on this PC has been like, what's in the PC, and what I overall like about the PC, what I don't like about the PC, that kind of stuff. So, FRAMERIPPER. Why is it called FRAMERIPPER? Because it's a Threadripper PC. It's a 1900X 8-core Threadripper PC, which was provided for me by On-AirPC. Both the Threadripper CPU and the motherboard, the Asus Prime motherboard that you see inside, were both provided to me by On-AirPC, and I would like to thank them very much for their consideration. So let's start off with the case. I love this case. This is a Fractal Design Define R6 case, and I will say there are a couple of quibbles that I'm not too hot on about the case, but overall, I'm very, very satisfied. First of all, it's a very quiet case. The case is surrounded in foam, or basically sound dampening material. There's a top plate that goes up here that has it on it. The front panel has it on it, and the panel on the kind of back side here, this back area is covered in it. So what that creates is a PC that's very, very quiet. Now, I have removed the top panel because I did install a 360 millimeter radiator inside of it, and it's actually really easy to do. There's a button on the back here that you pop, and the whole top plate comes off, and there's a filter with some venting that you just slide into the top, and that allows the top radiator to breathe fairly easily. I also love about this PC the way the panels come on and off. The side panel here, now most of the time when you get a tempered glass side panel, you'll see 4 screws, one on each corner, front and back, and you have to individually take off those screws to actually open the case. That's not the case with this PC. This case just pops off in the back, and then you can remove the entire panel just that easily. I gotta say, I adore that. I absolutely adore that. I think it's fantastic. It's just so much easier to get into the PC, so much faster and simpler to get in and out of the PC when you want to, as opposed to, it only takes probably 30 seconds to a minute to do those 4 screws, but you got to do them on both sides, and you got to do it every time you want to get into the case. Being able to just pop the thing on and off is just so much simpler. Now, if you want to travel with it or you want to pack it up nice and tight, there are thumb screws that go in the back that do secure the side panels on, so they just won't pop off in shipping. But for just sitting around on the floor or on your table, it is really nice to just be able to just quickly get in and get out of that PC. If you're somebody like me who likes to tinker with their PC quite a bit, it just makes it a much nicer experience. So let's talk about the actual performance of the PC and my impressions of the Threadripper build for streaming. So this is very much a streaming PC. The whole reason for this build is to literally take in the video signal, process it, and send it out to Twitch. Sometimes I'll be doing some video editing on this, but really it is primarily for streaming. And for that, I gotta say I'm very impressed with it. My impressions of Threadripper coming off of a Ryzen 1600, which is a 6-core processor, and this is only an 8-core processor. This is a 1900, so this isn't even like the high-end Threadripper stuff. This is so much more capable than the 6-core I was using before, and I'm going to assume it's about comparable to a 2700, which is the newer Ryzen processors. So if you're in the market for a streaming PC, you can pretty much, I'm going to guess, compare what I'm saying about Threadripper to the new Ryzen 8-core processors. But what I'm allowed to do by this processor that I was not allowed to do by the 1600 is to stream at a much higher quality. If I really want to push it, if you're familiar with OBS, I can stream at 1600 by 900 on the slow setting of OBS. So that's pretty good. Now, that's going to be using 95% of the CPU all the time. So In reality, I'll probably push it down to medium settings at 1600 by 900. If I want 1080 by, if I want full 1080 or 1900 by 1080, then I really have to push it down to faster. But this is a much more capable CPU for streaming than I found the 1600 to be. I never found the 1600 to be amazing, right? It was capable, but not amazing. This is much more high on the scale of amazing. Now, I did find right off the bat that I wasn't cooling it sufficiently. So if you watch the build log, then you saw that I actually used a Corsair 280 millimeter cooler, and it was a Asetek Corsair cooler. So what that means is Asetek basically is the supplier for the cold plate and the pumps that go right onto the CPU. And those Asetek units are circular and much smaller than the Threadripper IHS or the Threadripper CPU. They don't cover the entire CPU. And the Threadripper actually in the box, when you get the processor, comes with an adapter that will allow you to use one of those AIOs, one of those all-in-one liquid coolers to cool it. But I didn't find it was doing a sufficient job. It did a sufficient job with no overclock and running light loads. But once I started to overclock the processor and run heavier loads and do some testing, what I found was that the CPU never stopped heating up. It would, start off in the 70s under a pretty high load, go into the 80s, go into the 90s, and then essentially I would be forced to say, okay, quit it. It's not getting the job done. So I ended up replacing that unit with an Enermac LickTech 360. And you can see that is mounted on the top of the case. It actually goes all the way to the front of the case. It's a 360 millimeter radiator with 3 fans on it. And the cold plate, the pump and the cold plate actually cover the entire CPU. Since installing that AIO, that liquid cooler, I found that the Threadripper is staying much cooler. It's around, right now I'm running this with a 4.1 overclock. It's running at 4.1 gigahertz or whatever, and 1.4 volts to the CPU. So it's overclocked pretty high. I think it's capable of 4.2, but I haven't gotten it stable there yet. But at 4.1 with 1.4 volts, that was not a sustainable situation for the Corsair cooler. It would just continually heat up till I shut the system down. With this cooler on it, it runs at 61 degrees and just stays there. It stays there whether I'm running Prime 95, whether I'm streaming. I did a lot of streaming yesterday, just kind of testing out the system, making sure it was stable with the overclock, with the temps, with everything, and it just had absolutely no problem staying at 60 degrees. Whereas the Corsair cooler, it would start at 65, 70 degrees, and then it would just, as the liquid in the pump heated up and as the Threadripper heated up, it would just kind of keep climbing. It might take 2 hours to hit 90 degrees, but it would get there and it would just kind of keep climbing. So with the overclock, I found, you know what, I want to overclock the Threadripper. That's part of the fun of having a new computer. I definitely wanted a better cooler, and the Enermax is doing that for me. And I gotta say, it looks okay too. It's a pretty simple block sitting on top of the CPU. There's LED lighting. It just stays white. There's no way to change the color of it, but it looks fine there. What else have I changed since then? Obviously, I changed the fan configuration. If you watched, I actually had installed the Corsair radiator in the front of the case instead of at the top. That design change, I think, has actually improved the computer's thermals overall. So now that the 360 is mounted at the top, I just have 2 ML 240 fans, 140 fans, ML 140 fans by Corsair, just blowing air in. And I've got all the fan curves set up to be relatively quiet. In only rare cases will any of the fans go above about 50% of their total speed. And again, running very high loads, I'm never hitting above like 61, 62 degrees on the CPU. And the GPU is staying pretty cool itself. Now, the GPU, In the comments of the initial build video, there were some comments about the GPU and the RAM. GPU is in here because I had it. There's some other components of this computer that I didn't buy brand new for the computer. The Threadripper and the Asus Prime motherboard both came courtesy of On-AirPC, and I'm very grateful of that. The GTX 1080 graphics card was something that I had. It was replaced by a GTX 1080 Ti in my gaming PC. So that's why that's in there. The RAM is a leftover from when I was using the Ryzen. It's, I believe it's 2800 megahertz. And I'm actually talking to Ryan. We're probably going to swap that RAM out for faster RAM. Thing about RAM right now is it's crazy expensive. And there's a 16 gigabyte kit in here that runs at 2800 megahertz. To replace that with something faster is probably about $250 for the same amount of RAM. To get up to 32 gigs of RAM, which is my eventual goal, is about $450. Right now, until RAM prices come down, it doesn't make sense to make a small improvement in RAM speed, in my opinion. I'd much rather see if RAM prices come down and then, you know, upgrade to 32 megabytes instead of just getting another 16 gigabytes of faster RAM. So that's why there's 2800 megahertz RAM in there. It's the parts we had as opposed to going out and buying brand new parts. I'll also talk about the back to the GPU. I gotta say, I'm actually really happy with the GPU in here. Now, I've done quite a bit of testing with the FRAMERIPPER streaming and recording. And what I found is that what the GTX 1080 allows me to do is record while I'm streaming a very high quality version of what I'm streaming, much higher than what I'm actually streaming. And that's partially because of the GTX 1080. That's partially because of what OBS allows you to do. OBS actually allows you to stream and record at the same time, and you can stream using the CPU and record using the GPU. Now, I can probably get the same quality recording from a much lower quality or much lower end GPU, but again, I had this GPU, right? It was already here. So I'm not going to go out and buy a 1060 because it makes more sense for the build when I already have a 1080 that's not doing anything. Couple more things about the case is I did end up removing the top panel cover. It does come with, you know, this venting here that is very easy to take on and off because there's just a little release button in the back. With the fan curves that I have, it doesn't really seem to make that much of a difference as far as the noise levels. I've got them running very low RPMs. It seems completely maintainable. One thing I am a little bit concerned about with the case, there's a couple of quibbles I have about the case. One is that I wish it was about an inch taller because I wish there was a little bit more room above the motherboard so that when I mounted the radiator, I didn't have to cover up the VRM heatsink kind of at the very top of the board. You can see, you can't really see that. I'll show a little closer up in a minute here. I'm not super concerned about it because this motherboard actually has a fan on the VRMs itself down in the back by the I/O panel, so that if it gets up to, I believe, 60 degrees, I have it set up on now, it will actually start that fan up and start actively cooling the VRMs using that heatsink and fan. So hopefully that will mitigate my concern with actually covering the VRMs on the top of the board and not allowing them to get a ton of airflow, although they will get a little bit of splash from having the fans right next to them. The front of the case, one of the reasons I bought this case was because it does fit an extended ATX motherboard, which this motherboard is. And that was one of the qualifications for me buying a new case. It does fit in here, but it fits in a way that it covers the grommets that are supposed to be used for cable management, especially for the big 24-pin connector that plugs into your motherboard. I actually had to route that kind of around and not through the grommet. I probably could have fit it through the grommet, but it would have been kind of getting crushed by the motherboard and had a really tight turn to it. And I just wasn't comfortable with that over the long haul. So I decided to kind of route it around the motherboard panel. And because I have this front panel mounted up front, you can see this panel here could be mounted where it is, or you can move it to the back of the computer, like if you want to do water cooling or something like that, like a custom loop. But with it mounted here, you have much more room for hard drives, which I really like. Why don't we take a closer look inside of the case? Looking at the inside of the case a little closer, you can see a couple of things that I mentioned before and a couple of new things. So one thing I mentioned before is that it is an ETX compatible case, EATX, but like I said before, the motherboard covers about half of that grommet there, so there actually wasn't room for me to route the 24-pin cable through the grommet. I had to go around and behind the motherboard tray. Another thing I would like to show you, I'm sorry for the shaky cam, is the VRM Heatsink, especially toward the top of the board. There you can see the fans for the 360mm radiator, and next to it, with very little clearance, is the VRM Heatsink right there. And that goes all the way across here. I was initially concerned with the low amount of clearance. It doesn't touch, but it's very close, and there's definitely not a lot of room for airflow to actually allow that heatsink to work. But I am encouraged by the fact that there is a heat pipe that runs all the way through there and over to here in this heatsink, and then down through this heatsink. And this heatsink actually has a fan in it. That fan is controllable in BIOS. You can set up custom fan curves for it. So I'm going to monitor VRM temps in this setup, but I am hopeful that because of that fan and because of that heat pipe, we won't have an issue. Another issue, let me move the microphone up. At the front of the case with the 360mm cooler, there is very little clearance for the 360 cooler and radiator at on the side front of the case. It runs into that plate. It's basically touching that plate. Now, I didn't want to move that plate. That plate can be moved to the back of the case, basically where you see that foam in the back, or that sound dampening material in the back. This plate can go back there. But if you do that, you lose a bunch of hard drive support. So you can see at the bottom of the PC, there's a 2 terabyte hard drive, but there's also a bunch of mounting positions going basically all the way up the case behind this plate. And you lose those if you move the plate. So I really wanted the plate to stay up front. One, it looks kind of cool up here because it kind of covers, you know, like a bunch of empty area for this PC. And I wanted to be able to mount more hard drives. This computer, this motherboard, has 6 SATA connectors on it. You can see those right down there. 3 of them are populated right now, and I have 3 left, and I could definitely see myself populating 3 more hard drives, whether they're spinning disks or SSDs. Right now there's 2 SSDs in there and 1 spinning disk, but I could definitely see myself adding more hard drives to this computer as needed. Down at the bottom, this is a USB PCI expansion card. I really like having these. There's a couple of reasons for it. When I'm streaming, I have a ton of stuff plugged in through USB. I could have 1 or 2 capture cards plugged into USB, 1 or 2 webcams, mouse, keyboard, audio interfaces. I mean, just a ton of stuff gets plugged into USB on my streaming PC. There can be issues with that with bandwidth. Even though you have a ton of USB ports, if you don't have enough controllers, you can run out of bandwidth. So this adds a powered USB controller to the mix. I think there's actually 2 controllers on that card, I believe. I'm not positive. So if I do start running into USB issues, streamers run into USB issues like, and they can be hard to diagnose. It could be like, you know, the webcam looks fine at the beginning of the stream, but an hour into the stream, it starts to get choppy and starts to desync, or your game capture starts to get choppy an hour into stream, that's usually a bandwidth issue on USB. So anything you can do to fix that, I mean, these things are cheap. They're like 20 bucks. So that's a nice cheap fix for an issue like that. If you're having that issue on a computer you already have, try moving your USB into different ports. Maybe try using the front panel connectors on your PC for certain things, high bandwidth things, because often the front panel connectors and the rear panel connectors are on two separate controllers. And that can split up the bandwidth between, let's say, like a webcam and a game capture USB card. Another thing I wanted to mention is that as much as I love how the side panels come off of this thing, we're going to try and do the front panel here. Whoop. The front panel on this thing, we're going to move this back. I'm sorry for the shaky cam once again. Is very hard to take on and off, especially when you compare it to the front panel or the side panels. The side panels just pop right off, very easy to do. This side panel, first of all, you definitely want to take out your air filter off the bottom. Then you want to open the thing up and let's see, there's an air filter in here. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. You gotta pop this air filter out as well. So that comes out. And then you basically gotta like pry this thing off, and honestly it feels like I'm gonna break it like every time I do it. I hate the way this happens because like it's a very old style connector. Oh man, I do not like that. So I wish that the amazing design of the side panels, you know, kind of transferred to that front panel, because you can kind of see these are just like kind of friction fit fittings. These are just like these little plastic tabs. And, you know, after repeatedly doing this, it just gets scary, to be honest with you. I just don't like that. It feels like it's going to break every time you do it. You have to put so much flex on the plastic. Most of this panel, this, I believe, the actual front door is made out of aluminum, or it's got an aluminum plate on the front, but this frame is all just plastic, and because it's got those vent holes too, it's not very sturdy, so it just feels like it's going to break every time. So I definitely don't want to be removing that too often. It feels wicked chintzy. But that's basically it. That's my main concern about the case would be that front panel, taking it on and off. The EATX support, and I will say the SSD trays toward the back are a little fidgety, but once you get them in, you know, it's literally, you're never going to think about it again. So that's really going to do it for this video. Like I said, I'm very happy with the Threadripper. The difference in what my stream looks like with this processor compared to the 1600, it's fairly significant. I think even to an untrained eye, you can really see the difference. There's much less blockiness when I stream at the same bitrate, because I'm able to stream at a better quality setting. And for that reason, I really like this computer so far. So that's going to wrap this one up. Thank you guys very much for watching. Hit that like button if you liked the video. Hit subscribe if you're new to the channel. And I'll see you guys next time.